this episode, Jack and Marc discuss a history of very little known war tactics.
So, Jack, I understand you've been doing a little research into the history of conflict and wars.
I like to investigate the lesser-known tactics of war. That's where there's gold to be mined. And I came across the history of the Great Pacifist War. This was a bunch of pacifists who got together who wanted to stop the war, but then they got into big arguments about how to do it, and they started their own war.
You know, one side wanted to fight with fire. Was there one side that wanted to fight with water?
Well, that was the great tactic of switching all the enemy's water supply with vodka. Then they just waited for the troops to get completely plastered before they attacked.
What about other things to fight with? Wasn't there one group that wanted to fight with sand?
Oh, yes. Well, this was stage 2 of the whole vodka tactic. So they'd wait for the enemy to get plastered. And remember, both sides are pacifists. So they're not going to kill each other. But then they'd go charging in when the enemy is plastered and throw sand in their eyes and say, "Are you ready to give up?" This tactic was attributed to one of the more prominent pacifist generals.
Vegetation Sam. He used to dress up as vegetation and try to sneak into battles that way, but be unnoticed so he wouldn't have to participate. Wasn't that his M.O.?
He made a great hedge. The problem was, though, that he'd always place himself as a hedge in a very obvious location.
Like in the middle of the water.
Yeah, and he placed himself in the middle of a small pond in the middle of a big wide open field. And this was during the Napoleonic Wars. Napoleon comes along. "Look at that hedge in the middle of that small pond. Aim our cannons on that for target practice." Well, that was the end of General Vegetation Sam.
But you can only practice that once, so you only got one practice shot if it's a hedge.
They didn't hit it right away.
Okay.
Then he was a moving target because he started running away. And they said, the hedge is running away. And Napoleon declared anyone who could hit the moving hedge would get a free bottle of rum.
Now, Vegetation Sam, didn't he have a whole family? They were all dressed up as hedges and they made a big labyrinth?
Oh, Vegetation Sam had a very large extended family. There was about 500 of them in the nearby town alone. They heard Napoleon was coming down the local road, so they all dressed up as hedges and just created this big labyrinth maze right on the road.
Well, that's where the phrase hedge your bet comes from.
Yes, it does. Yeah, that's quite right. Yeah, I'm glad you've done your research. And so Napoleon went in there with his horses, and suddenly they're in this labyrinth maze of hedges. Unfortunately, the horses just started eating the hedges.
The labyrinth was no match for the giraffes.
Oh yes, little known fact that Napoleon always traveled with his favorite platoon of giraffes. And so when the hedges started to flee because all these animals are trying to eat them, Napoleon declared, "If there's one thing I can't stand is a pacifist disguised as a hedge."
Didn't he attempt to cross the Pyrenees with giraffes? Like Hannibal and the elephants, but it was Napoleon and giraffes.
That's right. Well, these guys, they're always in competition with each other.
Oh, they hated each other.
Well, as soon as Napoleon heard that Hannibal went over the mountains with elephants, he said, "I'm going over the mountains with giraffes." Of course, he didn't do the dirty work himself. He just arrested a whole bunch of pacifists disguised as hedges and told them, "Take my giraffes and go through the mountains."
Beta testers.
We'll show Hannibal who's a big shot.
Now, I heard that Napoleon, you know how he like those poses he makes where his right hand is shoved into his jacket?
Yeah.
I heard that he actually got stuck in that position because his hand was glued to his jacket. What's the story behind that?
The pacifists had their own humiliation squad. One of the pacifists, disguised as a hedge, snuck up to Napoleon's wardrobe tent. Then when no one was looking, he crept inside and squished glue into Napoleon's pocket. That's why he lost at Waterloo. He couldn't raise his right hand to give the signal for attack, so he raised his left hand, but that meant clean the latrines.
I mean, there was other ways they humiliated other generals. They came up with the whoopee cushion.
Oh, yes, the whoopee cushion.
They used that on the Russian General Zhukov, the guy at the Battle of Stalingrad. They used a whoopee cushion on him.
Oh, yeah, that was Operation Disguise a Whoopee Cushion as Zhukov's horse saddle. Every time he'd bark an order, he would fart at the same time. He couldn't get any respect.
That's why they lost that battle. And Rommel, didn't they put the black makeup on the binoculars? So when Rommel brought up the binoculars to his face, he had these 2 rings in his eyes. He was the desert fox, but after that, he was the desert clown.
And the humiliation squad, they used this special ink, which basically instantly tattooed the rings around his eyes. Yeah, he got the nickname Old Raccoon Rommel. After that, he had to put on flesh tone makeup.
But back then, the number of tones they had for flesh-colored was limited, and he could never really match it.
Oh, and boy, was he pissed off. He went back to Hitler to complain about the humiliation squad, and Hitler just started laughing at him so hard that he pissed his parade breeches. And then Hitler blamed Rommel for humiliating him, and so he gave Rommel the choice of killing himself locally or at a more pleasant holiday location.
There's a lot of famous battles throughout history. For example, there was the citrus spray battle. But tell me about that battle. You know when you squeeze a citrus, like grapefruit, when you squeeze it, the spray comes out? It was the citrus spray fruit battle.
Oh yeah, that was the humiliation squad's Operation Squirt Grapefruit Juice into General Zhukov's eyes. They switched his morning grapefruit with a special exploding grapefruit. Then a humiliation squad agent brought in the order forms for Zhukov, who was in charge of choosing whether to buy gray uniforms or white uniforms for the troops at the Russian front in the wintertime. Of course, he couldn't see a goddamn thing, and he signed the wrong forms.
Of course, the results are well known throughout history. Everybody knows what happened then. What about some of the other battles? Like, for example, the Battle of the Bulge. What do you know about that?
Oh, that was Operation Let's Humiliate the Generals with Excessive Bloating.
The Great Yeast Infection.
Operation Bloat was orchestrated by the super spy confectionery Hank. He sent holiday gift baskets to all the generals.
Candies.
They all, of course, pegged out on this stuff.
Especially those strawberry. Didn't he send a lot of those?
What Nazi general can resist a strawberry covered in chocolate?
No Nazi general can resist a strawberry covered in chocolate.
It's a well-known fact. These strawberries were all injected with this bloating yeast, and the bloating started immediately. It was like they were sitting there looking at each other, and they had a helium air hose stuck up their ass.
And they would tumble, right? When they would run into battle, they'd run, and they'd have their bayonet, and their bayonets would stick in the next guy beside them, and that would kind of cause them to deflate a bit.
Oh, yeah, and that would be one of the lucky ones. At least they decreased in size. The ones who had no deflation, they increased in their bloating until they were perfectly round. So these generals were so pissed off that they went and complained to Hitler. Hitler laughed so hard he pissed his lederhosen this time. Well, he was so humiliated, he told the generals they can either be executed or go fight Russians in North Africa.
Well, that's a little-known part of the war, that the Russians were actually in North Africa for a while.
Oh, these guys were so despondent. They just went back and ate the rest of the chocolate-covered strawberries until they bloated and exploded. And as you can see, that this kind of espionage is so insidious that the enemy doesn't even know it's actually happening.